Welcome back to the Election Whisperer. I am so excited on our Flipping Texas Spectacular to be sitting down with the one and only Beto O'Rourke to talk about his organization, Powered by People, and its effort to flip the Texas State House and its focus on state legislative elections. As you know, this show has been focusing quite a bit on legislative elections and trying to get people to understand how important those state level elections are and how the GOP used state legislative elections and the power of state government to really increase their influence, both in terms of public policy, but also in terms of being able to condense political power, both at the state and the federal level. So I'm here today in Texas, and unfortunately not all the way over there in El Paso, but here with Beto to talk about his organization, Powered by People. As America knows, Beto had his wildly successful Senate run here in Texas. And, this election forecaster had told everybody in the summer it was not Tennessee that people should be thinking about as a toss-up state. Tennessee is a state headed in the other direction. It is moving increasingly towards the Republican Party, as it is heavily populated by non-college educated whites. But Texas, on the other hand, is a state that has a lot of urbanization, a lot of suburban population, and a lot of college educated voters. Plus, it has a ton of ethnic diversity, not just Latinos, which of course everybody is pretty aware of, but also a lot of African American and Asian populations. And as the GOP has marginalized itself with its platform and with the election of Donald Trump, those populations have increasingly been looking leftward for political representation. So under a surge scenario, which is what my forecast is looking at, with a really galvanized Democratic, and left-leaning independent electorate who's terrified of what they're looking at in terms of the Republican Party and Donald Trump's governing style. Texas was, in my modeling work, a big bullseye. And one of the main bullseyes of it was this Texas Senate race. Now, under my work, I do talk a lot about the diminishment power of other long-term indicators like the economy, especially when it's good. When it's bad, it's a different story. It's a little bit more powerful still as an indicator. But things like candidate quality have really washed out unless it's an extremely good candidate or an extremely bad one, like Roy Moore in Alabama. And with Beto O'Rourke, you didn't need more than 5 minutes of video time with this candidate to know you were looking at somebody who was going to be extraordinary. And so my forecasting work really urged people to pay attention to Texas, that Texas would in fact be a toss-up. It wouldn't necessarily have quite enough momentum yet to flip, especially because you need infrastructure behind that momentum, and Texas had not had a democratic infrastructure built to support it. But I knew that it was going to, at the end of the day, come down pretty close to a 50-50 race, and that's, of course, exactly what happened. And as I've told my, people who follow my research over and over and over again, the two most successful races out of that 2018 cycle, other than the Arizona race, really were those Georgia and Texas races, even though they didn't come up with wins because of the extreme gaps that they had to overcome in deeply red states. And so a win in a lean blue state is, I'm sorry, not as impressive as an almost win in a state that you have a huge political disadvantage in. So when we're looking at one of the most successful candidates despite that loss, and of course, running in a presidential election as a trained political scientist with expertise in presidential campaigns, I can tell you it's very tough to do, even with more name ID than many of the other candidates. It was really always going to be between two candidates, Biden and Sanders. That's how presidential elections work, and that's why Don Jr. is probably a prohibitive frontrunner for the 2024 nomination. So when we look at Beto, he's come back to Texas, and he's really looking at what can we do to get the state, back on track? Obviously, it's suffered mightily under this Republican regime in terms of COVID and the economic strife that, not being able to have, a functioning economy because of a virus. So, the state house is really up for grabs. They picked up 12 seats in the natural Democratic surge on the coattails, frankly, of Beto's Senate run. And so he's created this Powered by People organization. It's a grassroots organization aimed at empowering voters. And I am going to turn over the floor to Beto so he can tell us about his organization, starting kind of from the idea of it and to what he built and what it's doing now. So Beto, finally, after that long-winded introduction, please tell us a little bit about Powered by People.
Well, first of all, I got to tell you, I am so glad to see you in Texas, even if I can't be in the same room or the same city with you right now. We're here in the Mountain Time Zone in the westernmost county of the 254 counties of Texas in El Paso. But I'm a big fan. And so we're honored by your presence in the state, and really so grateful for the way that you've helped us to see elections and what's possible in elections and what's possible in states that were long thought to be impossible, like Texas. So anyhow, thank you for being here and thank you for the work that you do. So you mentioned that Texas Senate race that we ran, and initially, early 2017, no one gave us a prayer. I had a name ID in the single digits in the state of Texas. Was running against the runner-up to the Republican presidential nomination in Ted Cruz, someone who had an extraordinary fundraising base and whose name ID was probably, hovering at 100% in the state of Texas, in a state that last elected a Democrat to the U.S. Senate in 1988, when Lloyd Bentsen was the last Democrat to win here in the state of Texas. So the odds were not looking good for us, but I did it more out of an imperative to confront what I saw as the single greatest challenge to democracy and our republic and the future of this country. Ted Cruz enabling someone like Donald Trump. And I was just going to go out and do it because I had to account for myself and be able to look my kids in the eyes. And when they said, Dad, when all this crazy shit was going on, when they were building walls and putting kids in cages and, the racism that the president was stoking and that Ted Cruz was enabling, when all that was going on, what did you do? And I wanted to have a good answer for our kids. And so off on the road we went. And as we traveled the state, and we went to places, Rachel, that had last seen a Democrat 30 years ago. I'm talking about the panhandle of Texas or North Texas or far East Texas. Democrats just gave up the field. They stopped competing, they stopped showing up, and there stopped functionally being elections in some parts of the state because Democrats feared to tread and Republicans didn't have a natural competitor. And so there was no accountability, no real representation in these communities that were starved for it. And so that was an eye-opener to me, as was the fact that there were so many people who wanted to help us. And by the end of that campaign, there were more than 20,000 volunteers just in the state of Texas who picked up a clipboard and knocked on doors or made phone calls for us. And we made, Rachel, a little over 1.2 million positive voter identifications, where we knocked on your door. We said, hey, is this Rachel Bitecofer? You said yes. Do you commit to voting for Beto? You said yes. Did we confirm that you voted in November of 2018? Yes. 1.2 million people who fit that description. It was the largest voter identification project in the history of the state of Texas. And by the way, we still have all those names and telephone numbers and addresses, and in many cases, relationships with both the voters and those 20,000 volunteers. And so I start there to explain and give you the context for where we are now. We are going back to that pool of volunteers, those more than 20,000 who worked for us for free in 2017 and 2018. And we are employing that volunteer muscle in the service of these state house candidates who, because of the extraordinary things that happened in Texas in 2018, are only 9 seats down from winning a majority for the first time in 20 years in the state house. Though I lost to Ted Cruz by 2.5 points, In 2018, we picked up 12 new seats in the state house. We picked up 2 new congressional districts, Colin Allred in North Texas, Lizzie Panel Fletcher in Southeast Texas. 17 African-American women elected to judicial positions in Harris County, home to Houston, Texas, the most diverse city in the United States of America, literally changing the face of criminal justice in the process, which sets us up for this year. And as you have been so eloquent on, if we win that majority, not only do we have great legislators who are going to reflect our aspirations, the opportunities that we see, the challenges that we want to face, they're also going to begin to dismantle the voter suppression and voter intimidation that exists in this state that has literally drawn out Black Texans and brown Texans and Texans in communities of color from being able to vote. And it's not me saying this. A federal judge in 2017 described this as racial gerrymandering, drawing Black Texans out of a congressional district to disperse the power of their vote and diminish the likelihood that they would vote at all, and concentrating the power of white voters. So here we are in 2020, a census year, which will be followed by 2021, a redistricting year in the state legislature. And winning at least 9 seats, which will put us in the majority, also gives us a seat at the table to begin drawing fairer maps and districts and ensuring that we have more people participating in our elections and in our democracy. Last thing, Rachel, we have to pick up 9 seats, right, to win a majority. There were 17 seats in 2018 that we lost by fewer than 10 points. And 9 of those seats, I actually won more votes than did Ted Cruz in those districts. We just didn't have the Democratic nominee for the state house getting across that finish line ahead of their Republican incumbent. So that's what we're focused on. And we are calling literally every registered Democrat in every state house district. We've made 24 million voter contact attempts so far with that amazing pool of volunteers that I talked about. And we want to double that before this election is decided on the 3rd of November.
So that's amazing. I mean, those are just startlingly large voter contact numbers. And of course, for context, we're talking about a startlingly large state to politically organize. I mean, the reason that Beto and I are doing this, even though I'm in Texas and so was he, we're both in the same state, is that El Paso is 10 hours away from Austin. So it's a very large organizational effort, and of course you're doing this via this new organization that you started once the presidential run ended, and it's called Powered by People. Tell us a little bit about that organization.
Yeah, so here's the rationale for focusing on these state house races. I talked about what we could do with the Democratic majority, dismantling that infrastructure of voter intimidation and voter suppression, and then having people who reflect the will of the electorate here in the state of Texas, which has been denied due to the gerrymandering, the 750 polling place closures, the most onerous voter ID laws in the United States, et cetera. But there's something you and I were talking about earlier. There's an article that you were featured in Salon recently, written by a guy named Paul Rosenberg, who's featuring your work and the work of Sam Wang from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And basically they're looking at the power of voters across the country. How much power does an individual voter have to determine the composition of their state house, who the next senator will be in their state, and who will win the electoral college votes in their state. And they've come to the conclusion that Texas has the highest voter power, and that if we organize around these state house candidates in these state house districts, and if we enlarge the electorate by adding net new voters to the rolls, which Powered by People is helping to do, we registered over 77,000 new likely Democratic voters in the state of Texas in these competitive state house districts. If we target and reach out to, not in an automated fashion, but human being talking to human being, the voters who will decide the outcome of these elections, something these state house candidates probably on their budgets could not afford to do on their own, a field program they could not mount with the resources that they have. If we do that, not only do we win a majority in the state house, we also push voters up ballot instead of looking at coattails coming down ballot to the US Senate race, where MJ Hagar is squaring off against John Cornyn, arguably Trump's strongest enabler in the United States Senate and his translator to the voters here in Texas. And then this, Rachel, this is, in my opinion, the holy grail in American politics. Texas last voted for the Democratic nominee for president in 1976, when I was 4 years old. If in the year 2020, given the historic nature of this election and everything that's on the line, if Texas on the night of November 3rd, or whenever the votes are finally tallied, comes in the Democratic column and chooses Joe Biden over Donald Trump, I firmly believe that will allow us to turn the page on Trumpism in America. My fear is that absent a win in Texas, if Joe Biden has lawfully won the election in the Electoral College, but the result is relatively close, Donald Trump will seek to exploit that small or narrow difference to create confusion and chaos, try to invalidate the results, and claim another election victory illegally. The greatest defense against that is a very strong offense here in the state of Texas. And so I believe organizing, as Powered by People is doing, around these state house races, enlarging the electorate to ensure that we send a majority to Austin in 2021, will send energy and voters up ballot and help Joe Biden become the first president since Jimmy Carter to win Texas as a Democrat. So that's how we're organizing. That's what we're doing, registering new voters, contacting personally and not in an automated fashion existing registered voters, and making sure that we have the largest voter turnout in Texas history.
Yeah, so what's enticing for sure about Texas, and I think this is a reason that we've already seen some activity here from Biden and as well as from the Lincoln Project, which of course, whenever I mention Lincoln Project, I always disclose that I am a senior advisor on the Lincoln Project, so it's important for me to always disclose that. But the reason I think we see that is that before this new electorate, at least by my theory, the electorate got shooken up by the election of Donald Trump. When that election occurred, there was a complacency on the other half of the electorate, a kind of feeling of inevitability for Hillary Clinton to win, and turnout lagged in not so much the overall turnout, but the turnout in marginal areas where it really mattered, younger voters, diverse voters. And what we saw, though, even under that lower turnout model, we saw a couple of interesting things. And we saw in Georgia and Texas very narrow margins for the Republican nominee, atypically narrow margins. And that was without this massive turnout boost that we've seen in elections since Donald Trump. So I do think, and of course we had the 2018 cycle, and both Georgia and Texas really, really competitive. I mean, the Georgia primary in 2020, the participation there has been just really amazing. And I think that there's a recognition of how, I think Democrats are starting to realize that there's just a lot of, under this realignment situation, in the suburbs of Houston, in Dallas, especially, that there's untapped voter potential. Then, the question is, of course, how much do they recognize that it's, a product of two things? There are current, independents who are de-aligning from the Republican Party as it's embraced populism and nationalism and Donald Trump. And that stuff has been exacerbated by the pandemic. I think there were this chunk of independents that have hung, because they are right-leaning independents, they have conservative ideology, they have hung with Donald Trump through the other stuff, which they saw mainly as political bickering. But when it came to the pandemic and his handling of the pandemic, it was a different banana, right? And you see erosion in support amongst some of these voting groups. So, voters over the age of 65. But really what we're looking at is erosion of right-leaning independents over that handling. And it has really blown the doors off of a state like Texas. So if Texas was an attractive possibility prior, it has now become an extremely attractive possibility because there's two effects, and that's what my September update will be really focused on. Two really strong drivers of benefit to both sides, benefiting the Democratic side of the electorate. The natural negative partisanship atmospheric advantage that I've been talking about for several years now, but also now this pandemic effect. And that has been, Beto, very strong here in Texas, of course, because in Texas, it's a red state. It's not Virginia. Virginia had a Democratic governor, it had a Democratic legislature, and therefore it had, kind of a science-based reaction to the pandemic. Northam is a very moderate, cautious governor. He definitely was a little cautious about, he wasn't like, I'm shutting down everything and we're leaving it shut forever like Michigan, but he definitely observed the science and took the scientific recommendations. Here in Texas, it was a whole different story. Like, things got reopened right as the virus was really first hitting here because it took time to spread across the country. And so therefore, like I was just telling my camera crew, outside of Texas, the perception is Texas is a very dangerous place to travel to because the infection rates are so high. So tell me a little bit about your perceptions since the pandemic surge hit. Has it become, do you think, more attractive for Democrats in that environment?
Well, you're absolutely right about the unique political dynamic that exists here. So every major position of public trust and responsibility at the state level is controlled by a Republican. So our governor, and as you probably know, our lieutenant governor, which some would argue is a stronger political position even than our governor, Dan Patrick on Fox News argued for this state to prematurely open, even before we'd hit the hardest of the first wave. And his case was summarized as follows. There are more important things than living, he told the host on Fox News. So in other words, let's get on with the dying. But as you know, and as your viewers know, and your listeners know, not everyone is dying equally. And in Texas, COVID is decimating Latino communities, African-American communities, and Native American communities. And so you go down to the Rio Grande Valley in Harlingen and Cameron counties and Starr County. So many people have died over such a short period of time that they've run out of room in their morgues and funeral homes, and they are stacking dead bodies of people who live in those communities, US, Texas citizens, in refrigerated FEMA trailers right now. And the county judges of those 90 to 95% Mexican-American communities appealed to Governor Abbott, again, Republican, in a completely Republican-controlled state, and said, look, I understand you don't want to issue a statewide stay-at-home order. That's fine. Allow us, as the chief executives in these counties, to do so to save the lives of the people who are dropping all over right and left. The governor denied their appeal, refused to allow the local control these Republicans often tout when it serves their political interests, but in a matter of life and death, refused to save the lives of our fellow Texans. And Rachel, to your point, that's not lost on everyone here. More than 13,000 people have died, so many preventable if we follow the facts and the science and the truth and the best public health advice, and so many predictably died when we failed to do that. And I do think that's going to be very much on the minds of voters going into this election. I mean, this basic question of competence. Can you keep me and my family safe? Why is my business still having to stay closed months after the first lockdown, where you could have expanded testing and contact tracing and done all the things that government is supposed to do so that this pandemic would be past us and I could reopen, I could rehire my employees, I could get back to doing the thing that I was born to do and put on this planet to perform. That's not possible in this state. And it's not possible solely for the failure of leadership at the federal level with Donald Trump and at the state level with the Republicans who are in charge of the state Senate, the state House, the lieutenant governor, the governor, every other major position of public trust. And so if ever there were the case for change, in an election, it is in this one where, Rachel, in the first 2 months of this pandemic in Texas, twice as many Texans filed for unemployment as did in all of 2019. And as you know, many of them have yet to be able to come back to work, or those who are going back to work are doing so out of economic necessity, knowing that they're taking their lives in their hands when they work these $7.25 an hour jobs, because that's the minimum wage here in Texas. And if we, those of us who are campaigning or who are helping the candidates who are campaigning, can connect the dots for people and say, look, this was not just an act of God. This is not a natural disaster. So much of this was predictable and preventable, and those in power failed to do so. And you have a chance to change that at the ballot box this October 13th, the first day of early voting in Texas, and on November 3rd, election day. I think that is our mandate.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of my conversations about the role of messaging, because there are places where you need a combination of turnout. You have to equalize the percent of ballots returned by Democrats and Republicans if you want to win these races, right? I mean, that is just a crucial element of winning a competitive race. As the election in California's 25th special election, like, it was really great to see that election play out, because all of America got to watch an election the way I see it, all elections actually, because it was a partisan election, so it's party registration in California, and it was an all vote by mail. So all of the election analysis world watched an election return process in which they were tracking the return process through party and not just general ballots. And therefore, when the result came in and Mike Garcia flipped the seat, the Republican candidate won it pretty handily, in fact, taking it from the Democrats who had picked it up in the blue wave. Everyone could see quite plainly, actually, what had happened was that Republicans had returned 14 points worth of more ballots than Democrats. And it wasn't a story of independent swing changing preferences, right? But in a blind election, which is how most are done, where you don't have that party indicator, it would have looked like there was a big preference change in the election electorate, right? If you didn't know that, like, Republicans had outvoted Democrats, right? So it's in the forecast update, I'm going to be able to show, like, okay, this is what I'm trying to teach you guys. Like, you have to equalize your Democratic voting to the Republican voting if you want to have a chance to win, because I don't think there's any argument you can make in California's 25th district that there was some sentiment that made independents much more favorable all of a sudden to Republicans. It was simply that, they sent their best ballot return team in the country, the GOP did, to that special election, and they did a great ballot tracking return process there, where the Democrats just kind of dropped the ball, right? So when you're looking at Texas, though, it is going to take, if statewide, it is going to take a persuasion element. You have to win the persuasion argument. And I think it's getting the electorate to understand that we're living through a pandemic experience in this country that is, unlike all the other Western democracies, right? Up to the north in Canada, 200,000, 300,000 people aren't going to just die of this pandemic, right? Over in all of the other countries, they chose a series of policy responses that mitigated their pandemic, and then they did test and trace and staged reopenings based on data and reality, and they didn't have a culture war about a simple mask, right? And so, like, we're living through this, like, pandemic nightmare in which we're literally sacrificing thousands of human lives, that is completely self-imposed. And it's really important, I think, if Democrats want to have a successful cycle in a state like Texas or Georgia, that they are able to articulate that very clearly and concisely for voters, because otherwise I think it's a mistake to assume that voters just know that. I think many Americans actually are unaware how how unique our own pandemic experience is and exactly why it's that unique. Though I think a lot of them do understand, kind of loosely speaking, that Trump has not managed it well. I don't think they really understand like how poorly his decisions were and how like unorthodox they were compared to other world leaders, approaches. So I think you're right. I think it's a huge issue. And I also think too that it's a major importance to emphasize the economic response difference, right? You have one party in Congress who says, look, we need massive stimulus and aid relief, economic relief, and for Mitch McConnell to deliver any aid through the Senate, he's going to be relying on Democrats because more than half of the Republican caucus in the Senate believes that there should be no aid, right? I mean, that's basically half of the Republican Party says the economy needs no additional stimulus.
Yeah, and I think having candidates who can connect that to this upcoming election and reach out to voters, Rachel, in Texas, who I mentioned have been estranged from the political process by law, drawn out of a congressional district, or made it very difficult for them to register to vote or to actually vote due to voter ID or polling place closures. And then in the midst of COVID, this deadly pandemic, for a virus against which none of us have any immunity, the state won't allow mail-in voting unless you are 65 years or older or have a physical condition that would prevent you from going to the ballot box. And so if you are one of these voters, you live in a community that has been drawn out or been told in no uncertain terms, we don't want you participating, then I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are working on these campaigns to intentionally, specifically prioritize those communities and reach out to them. And last week with Congressman Veronica Escobar, we called voters along the Texas-Mexico border. So communities like mine in El Paso or McAllen, Texas, Eagle Pass. And many of those conversations, Rachel, took place in Spanish. And Veronica speaks Spanish, I speak Spanish. So we could listen to these voters in Spanish. A lot of them are not paying attention, not on their radar for whatever reason. And I can sit safely here in my home and judge them for not being politically involved, or I can listen to them as I did on the phone and realize some of them are working 2 or 3 jobs. Some of them picked up the phone at the Circle K or 7-Eleven that they're working the night shift at. And they just haven't had time to participate. But by having someone, a fellow Texan, call them and remind them about this election or listen to them about this election, we're inviting them to participate. And I don't know what that will do to turnout, to your point about turning out our voters, but it is not going to hurt. And we know that the GOP is going to throw everything at Texas because they get, perhaps better than the National Democrats do, right? They get that this is their firewall. They lose this, they lose the country literally forever. A victory for Biden in Texas on November 3rd is seismic in forever reordering the political landscape in America. And you know this stuff better than I do, and you can articulate it far better than I can. But I think Republicans get this by what I see coming into this state. And I think our challenge is to acknowledge that, the National Democratic Party and perhaps the Biden campaign, they've got a lot of contests to focus on in states that are smaller, whose media markets are a little bit less expensive. And frankly, and this, there's an inertia to the way that lifelong political consultants see the electoral map. And just, if you've never seen Texas as competitive, it's really hard to see what's right in front of your nose, which is that this is competitive. And so I really think it's going to be up to us here in Texas to bring this to pass. But what I feel so good about is there are so many Texans who are fired up to do this work. And you're meeting them in Austin, both the candidates and their supporters and the volunteers and the thousands of people who are making these powered by people outbound voter contact and voter identification calls. So it is going to be about turnout, but I think we've got the people who are willing to do the work to turn those voters out and to connect with them and also to connect the dots for them or with them while they're on the phone. I think that's what it's going to take.
Yeah, me too. And I have to say, the enthusiasm that you're seeing, both quantitatively and qualitatively in Texas, is through the roof. I mean, there's a lot of evidence for it, and there's a lot of evidence too that the DCCC must be seeing, because they have added, quite a few races this early to their red to blue list. Now, I expected eventually that they would get hip to the square on how competitive Texas was, but I figured it would be late, not before Labor Day, that they figured it out. So the fact that they've added so many races already to red to blue from Texas really is it indicates to me that there really must be very clear signals, because I'm usually much more ahead of the D trip, and so like they if they're seeing it through their process, it really must be quite bright, right? So that and that of course is great, because the more attention that is on those House federal, there's massive overlap, of course, with the state House candidates. Now, the one thing too that probably should be highlighted is the state legislature changed the law in Texas recently. I don't know when they did, but didn't they change it recently to get rid of the straight ballot?
You're right. There's no longer going to be straight ticket voting. This will be the first election where you won't have it. It was passed in a prior legislative session, and your instincts on this are right on the money. That this is not to do anything with democracy, and everything to do with a cynical attempt to try to hold on to power. And for the casual voter, I think the thinking goes, who came out to vote for Joe Biden without having straight ticket voting in Texas, they're unlikely, the thinking goes, to vote down ballot and select Candace Valenzuela for U.S. Congress, or to select Brandy Chambers for the state House, or the Democrat for the county commissioner's court. But what's interesting is that the state Democrats, all of us have responded by, instead of focusing on that Biden race, we're really focusing on the bottom of the ballot, and meeting this by focusing voters' attention on those candidates for the state House, and then hopefully sending their votes and their energy and that enthusiasm and the expanded electorate up ballot to Biden. So I think there's more than a match for this cynical attempt to try to depress down ballot voting in Texas.
Yes, I mean, and then it really is about strategic adjustment, right? So at that point, you need much better coordination. You need the state House and federal House and Senate and presidential candidates to be sending out direct mailers with the full ballot, and people standing at the polling locations with those little I don't know if you can do that in Texas, but in Virginia you can stand a certain distance away in the parking lot and pass those out. And but it's really critical, because the last thing you want on election, when the election is held, is districts in which Biden carries the district, but because of ballot drop off, you end up with some state House candidates or seats that don't flip, right? And obviously, as you point out, it was a cynical change done, because research is pretty clear that ballot drop off does tend to affect Democrats more, because of the fact that it's usually younger voters and minority voters who tend to do ballot drop off. So it does put a lot more need on voter education when you can't do the party straight ticket. So it's a change, is another institutional change that will require adjustment, and some more, I think, more strategic thinking on behalf of all of the various campaigns. But it's something I think that you just have to work around. I think they also considered briefly legislation to make the state into a mini electoral college, did they not?
Yeah, I mean, there have been so many proposals to, I mentioned the most recent examples of voter suppression, but you probably know this as a student of history. I mean, this goes back 144 years to the end of Reconstruction. So
Yeah.
Jim Crow and segregation laws. In Texas, you may or may not know this, beginning in 1924, due to a law passed by the state legislature in 1923, if you were Black, you could not by law vote in the Democratic primary in a state where the Democratic primary was dispositive. Only Democrats won the offices in the state of Texas, as was true for much of the Deep South. And that persisted for 20 years until 1944, which is just nuts to me that in the lifetime of some of our fellow Texans, this state denied by race explicitly, not functionally, but explicitly and functionally, that if you were Black or you were in a community of color, you could not vote, you could not participate in this democracy. And that has now cynically been replaced by the racial gerrymander, the 750 polling place locations, and everything else that's happening right now. So these efforts will continue apace until you have a change in the composition of the state legislature. And that's why this is so important. And one of the things I forgot to mention, Rachel, and the importance of redistricting following the census year, and you've actually written about this, talked about this, Texas is about to pick up a few new congressional districts due to the fact that we're now at 30 million people living in the state, explosive population growth, which, as you also pointed out at the top of the show, is comprised of people from really every walk of life, every ethnic background, every country on the planet. Houston, Texas, as an example, in Harris County, in their public schools, they speak more than 120 different languages. There are more Vietnamese language speakers in the city of Houston than in any other city anywhere in the world except for in Vietnam. And so you're going to see a real revelation and a reflection of the diversity of the electorate in Texas if we can draw fair maps and draw all these folks in. And then you will look at the composition of our US congressional delegation, and it will start to look like this minority majority state that we are. So this is super exciting, super important, but absolutely critical that we do our work, because Republicans get this as well. And they know that this is their last stand. And if they win it, they're relatively safe for the next 10 years. If they lose it forever. And those are the things that we have to keep in mind as we do this work. And as you know, phone banking, don't let anyone fool you. Not fun, not easy. You're working with unproven lists of voters and phone numbers that might not match up to the right person. You might get Trump voters on the line who, after a few four-letter words, hang up the phone on you. You might get the Democratic voter that you were looking for, but it's super necessary if we're going to return to these Democratic candidates ahead of early voting, a reliable, actionable, effective, honest list of who their voters are. So, to the point that you've been making forever, so that we can turn them out, because that's what it all comes down to at the end of the day. And so that's what we're working on with Powered by People.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. I mean, a lot of these districts in the ones that pop into Austin are going to be heavily reliant on those little tails that fly into the Austin area. But the Houston and Dallas realigning districts, these are ripe suburban. I mean, we're talking about suburbs that are, much more diverse. They're not just full of white people. And they're heavily populated by millennials who are 40 and going bald and have children. And that's who lives in the suburbs, even some Gen Zers on the front side now. And they are ripe for the picking, but they've never been organized because the resources have always been devoted towards that middle of the voter file. And so it's really unbelievable potential growth for Democrats in these areas. So it's great to see an organization that's aimed at finding, identifying, organizing, and tapping into Texas. I mean, Texas has. I'll close out by saying this. In the 50 states, we have voter turnout data for each state, organized by Mike McDonald. His United States Election Project is the go-to data source for election data, turnout data, because he does voting eligible population, which of course keeps in mind the people who are unable to vote for felon disenfranchisement. So anyway, Texas is always in the bottom 20%, and if not like at the, near the very bottom. And we see rates of like 37%, right? There is so much growth potential in Texas from turning out latent Democratic and Democratic leaning population. There's no reason that Texas could not flip blue if the organization identified and turned out people. So it's not so much that you have to like change the minds of these stalwart, very committed Trump people. You just need to spend the time and the money to find, because most people don't follow politics. I mean, the camera crew didn't know who Nate Silver was. That's how normal people are. We're not normal people. I try to convey that, like, we are freaks. Like, they are the normal people. We're the weirdos because we know who Nate Silver is. And, we need to find a way to get to the normal people and get them involved in civics and civic government. And that will help also moderate the electorate and get more rational people who are able to have a discussion about police, violence and, the struggle between policing and racial justice, right? So it's important. It's a very important project. So I'm so glad to be able to talk with you about it and to get your insights, and it's been a great convo.
I'm so glad that you're in Texas, and I'm so glad that you're bringing this country's focus to what I think is the biggest battleground state in the union right now, and where voters, I think, have an outsized ability to determine the course that this country is going to take, especially in these state rep districts. So thank you. Thanks for the time and the interest and the focus on our state.